Welcome to this slideshow by the Barbara Pym Society. From 1961 to 1974, while working at the African Institute, Barbara Pym lived at 40 Brooksville Avenue, Queen's Park, London, with her sister Hilary. They attended the nearby St. Laurence's Church, Brondesbury. However, in 1971, 2 years before her retirement, a decision was made to merge St. Laurence's with Christ Church, and St. Laurence's was closed and later demolished. It must have been a wrench for them to be forced to give up the church they'd become used to, but Barbara took it philosophically. They looked around for another church in the area that suited their preferences and decided on St. Mary Magdalene, Paddington. This is a large church located in Rowington Close, almost next to the section of the Grand Union Canal known as Little Venice. For anyone who may be considering a visit, there's a nice little cafe located in the extension to the church. It's called the Grand Junction and it overlooks the canal. To return to the church, it was completed in 1872, and the architect was George Edmund Street, a leading light in the Victorian Gothic revival, the style in which the church was designed. The stained glass windows were designed by Henry Holliday, an artist of the pre-Raphaelite school. Barbara wrote about her new church to her friend Bob Smith as follows. Since the closing, we have been to St. Mary Magdalene's, Paddington. It has rather good music and quite an amusing vicar dragging on a cigarette and curate who live in a startlingly modern clergy house just opposite the church. A smoking vicar was likely to appeal to Barbara, herself a heavy smoker. The present vicar, Father Henry Everett, was able to identify him, though he had never met him, as Father Stevenson. Father Michael Stevenson was the vicar for a long period and was certainly the incumbent at the time Barbara attended. We're disappointed that we haven't managed to find any images of Father Stevenson. He was trained at St. Stephen's House in Oxford, only a few streets from St. Hilda's, and served his curacy at Holy Trinity, Hoxton, another London parish. He came to St. Mary Magdalene in 1964 and remained there until he retired. His mother came to live with him at the clergy house for a time. He took an interest in the work of local groups such as the Scouts. Despite his long association with St. Mary Magdalene, his funeral was at Holy Trinity, Hoxton. When Father Stevenson took over the church, it had no vicarage. Like his predecessors, Father Stevenson lived in a nearby flat until 1969. You can see from this slide that following wartime bombing, which thankfully didn't affect the church, much of the substandard housing was demolished by the local authority. It wasn't really until the 1960s that it began to be built up again, and the surroundings are now very different. Barbara called this the clergy house, which is fair enough since Father Stevenson was, we understand, unmarried and shared the accommodation with his curate. We haven't so far been able to find out the curate's name. Barbara also referred to it as startlingly modern, which in 1971 it certainly was. Father Henry still lives in the same house, which now has a sign saying the vicarage, which is helpful as most people would not immediately recognize it as one. In recent years, St. Mary Magdalene has benefited from lottery heritage grants and other donations, and this has enabled them to carry out extensive restoration work and also to build an extension, giving them additional space that can be used by the community. The magnificent painted ceiling created by Daniel Bell has been completely restored so that the design can now be seen in all its colourful glory, something that Barbara would never have been able to see because the ceiling in 1971 had accumulated a century of dirt, made worse by London's polluted air and smoke. Beneath the nave is the vaulted undercroft, and adjoining the crypt is a chapel designed by another notable architect of the Gothic revival, Ninian Comper. Comper lived until 1960 and was a friend of John Betjeman, who at some time in the 1960s or 70s made a programme about the architecture of St. Mary Magdalene. It's available on a DVD called Four with Betjeman. It was also Betjeman who took John Julius Norwich to see the church, telling him that it was a corker. Lord Norwich was a well-known historian in the UK who just happened to be a viscount. He later became patron of the appeal to raise money to restore the church and helped obtain a £3 million grant from the Lottery Heritage Fund, which Barbara would certainly have approved of. If you think he looks rather forbidding in the photo on the left, the one on the right shows that he was far from that. He seems to have said something that had Father Henry in stitches. That photo was taken in 2017 at the groundbreaking ceremony for the extension to the church. Father Henry is of the opinion that Barbara must certainly have seen the crypt, but again, sadly, she would have seen the chapel in its present, rather dilapidated state. She would nevertheless have been able to appreciate the richness of the original decoration. The chapel, too, is now awaiting full restoration. These aren't the only literary connections. Father Henry told us that the Crypt Chapel was used to film a scene in the musical film of Les Miserables. Although the still from the film is by its nature very blurry, you can make out the background fairly clearly. And that's not all. There is clear evidence that P.D. James's 1986 novel, A Taste for Death, one of her Adam Dalgliesh series, used St. Mary Magdalene as the model for its setting. She was, of course, a good friend to the Pym Society, and this photo was taken during one of her many visits to St. Hilda's, where she was an honorary fellow. She knew London well and could easily have been aware that Barbara had worshipped here. However, it seems that in public she denied all knowledge of the church, and the theory is that she was reluctant to admit that she had used Father Stevenson, the smoking vicar, as the model for one of her characters. One last snippet of information. It's said that the composer, John Ireland, visited the church after he moved to London. Despite having been organist and choirmaster at several other London churches, St. Mary Magdalene made a great impression on him, and it was after seeing this church that he made a definite decision to follow Anglo-Catholicism. Although we're disappointed that we have no slides of Father Stevenson, he did write a booklet about the history of the church. And what a history. I hope you've enjoyed this short presentation. If you ever happen to be visiting London, do look out St. Mary Magdalene. It's well worth a visit.